Tonight's talk will address a number of issues, but the basis of it comes from an article Dr. Bowman wrote in 1995 and updated in April 2009, entitled War and Christian Theology, Implications for Church and State. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Bob.
Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming. It's a great crowd, and I'm pleased to be here in Walkerton. When I first put Walkerton on the schedule, I was advised, oh, it's a great little town, friendly people, just don't drink the water. I understand things have changed and you now have the cleanest, safest water in Ontario, so congratulations. Paul has asked me to give some insights from my paper on Christian theology, and I'll do so. My main emphasis at the moment is ending the phony war on terror and the occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. This is illuminated, I think, somewhat by a reflection on Christian theology, because in our countries, the United States and Canada, there are enough Christians, I believe, that if all of us refused to engage in wars which are contrary to Christian theology, there wouldn't be enough people left to fight the wars that our government wants to get into. Now you see, there are only two schools of thought in Christian theology. One, the nonviolence school, says that participation in war is immoral and sinful, and Christians may not do it. This was the position of the entire church for the first 300 years of its existence. The second school of thought says participation in wars is immoral and sinful, and Christians may not do it. However, there is a rare exception to this general rule, that if a war satisfies 8 criteria, called the just war criteria, then indeed it's okay for Christians to participate. This change was brought about when the church emerged from the catacombs and entered into the halls of power under Emperor Constantine. This rationalization that, well, sometimes it's okay to fight in Caesar's wars was developed by St. Augustine and later refined by Thomas Aquinas. And eventually, of course, it came to the point where the church ignored the 8 criteria and essentially says, well, do whatever Caesar wants. And 1700 years later, we're still doing it. And this, I think, is when the church prostituted itself under Constantine, giving up its principles and turning away from the clear teachings and example of Jesus of Nazareth. As a matter of fact, I contend that Christianity today is practiced in the vast majority of our churches is unrecognizable as a religion of Jesus. Indeed, Jesus is entirely absent from most of our denominations. The churches worship an ethereal risen Christ, but seem to ignore the flesh and blood Jesus of Nazareth. Now, theologians haven't changed the rules. There isn't a Christian theologian in any denomination who refutes those two schools of thought. And so, they just ignore it. And our pastors ignore it. Because if our pastors taught what the church believes on paper, there wouldn't be any Christians to fight the wars. Because there has not been a war in perhaps hundreds of years, at least, probably more than that, that has satisfied the 8 just war criteria. Certainly, there has not been a war in my lifetime that satisfies even 1 or 2, with the possible exception of World War II. See, the just war criteria fall into 2 categories. Most of them have to do with the decision to go to war. And the criteria for that, it must be in a just cause, it must be declared by a competent authority, which in my country means Congress has to announce a declaration of war. You have to have the right intention. It must be a last resort, everything else having been tried. You must have a probability of success. There must be proportionality of goals. The good to be gained or the evil to be avoided has to exceed the cost of the war in lives, in money, in the environment, and so forth. And the last 2 criteria have to do with how the war is conducted. Proportionality of means. You can't use weapons that cause more damage than they prevent. And finally, discrimination. You must discriminate between combatants and non-combatants, and you must strictly avoid harming non-combatants. Now, World War II may have satisfied many of the criteria for going to war in the first place. It certainly violated the last 2 criteria having to do with how you conduct the war, because there is no way that the use of either nuclear weapons or firebombing of cities, such as we did against Hamburg and Tokyo and Dresden and Osaka, can satisfy the criteria of proportionality of means or discrimination. Indeed, when we dropped the atomic bomb unnecessarily on Hiroshima, we killed hundreds of American soldiers who were there as prisoners of war. And we knew they were there. When we also very unnecessarily dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki, we incinerated the most Christian city in Asia. A city teeming with Roman Catholic convents. And the Roman Catholic Cathedral